All right, guys, we're going to start the lecture for Chapter 4 today. I'm going to break this one up into two different lectures, Part 1 and Part 2. Part 1 is going to be kind of getting us in the mode of discussing what are simple organic molecules and what is an organic molecule, how we build on organic molecules, and it's all based on this idea that carbon is such an important atom for life, and in fact it is. We see carbon in absolutely everything that's alive, and then how we can build diverse molecules from carbon. Second half of this will be something dealing with what are known as isomers and the diversity that isomers create in our biological molecule diversity, and what they can do, how those isomers actually interact with our body a lot. Okay? So, without further ado, let's go ahead and start Chapter 4. Here's some of the targets that you need to have kind of figured out by the end of this. If you haven't figured these out, you need to either ask for help or go back through and figure out exactly what it is that you need to do to be experts at this stuff. Now, like the last one, I think I mentioned that these statements they're extremely broad, and there's a lot of different facts and bullet points within each one of them that you have to know to really get a grasp of the entire thing. So do keep that in mind, that these are very broad in nature and that there's a lot of detail that goes with them. All right, so Chapter 4 deals with organic molecules. Organic molecules are any molecule that contains carbon, and any molecule that contains carbon is organic, and anything that's living is organic. It has carbon in it somewhere. Now, carbon is oftentimes attached to many, many different types of things in many, many diverse ways, which we're going to elaborate on as we work our way through this material. Some of the more common ones, and which are oftentimes considered the major elements of life, are listed here. Carbon oftentimes attaches itself to hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. I affectionately call these schnapps. When you turn 21, you'll realize what schnapps are. It's not spelled the same way, but it's something I like to put into, hot chocolate or coffee around Christmas time, and it makes Christmas time a little bit more merrier. So if that helps you remember the elements of life, fine, so be it. If not, you can figure out a different way. But schnapps is an easy way for me to remember those. Okay, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. In previous tests, I'd always put a gimme question that said, what are the elements of life? And you'd have to remember those. So I may do that again, I'm not sure, but be prepared if it is. But those are the elements that we're going to see attached to these organic molecules so often. They're constantly found in some of those most important ones that we see. In Chapter 5, we're going to talk about in depth about proteins, nucleic acids, lipids, all these different types of large macromolecules. For instance, proteins, you see carbon in proteins, you see nitrogen in proteins. Some proteins have oxygen in them. Okay, so you see almost every single one of those elements that we listed above in proteins. Nucleic acids. One of the biggest ones we're going to see there is obviously carbons in every single one of them. Actually, I think you see all of them in nucleic acids in some form. Lipids, you see a lot of carbon and hydrogen in the lipids. You see some of the oxygen in lipids. So these major macromolecules that build up our structure, that are us, right, contain every single one of these elements. Okay. Now, that's going to play. I don't want it to play. That's kind of a nice option that it does. Okay. I'm going to link this video I'm going to link this video in the Google Classroom with this particular PowerPoint, with this particular lecture, but I'm not going to have you watch it here. I do want you to watch it. It's interesting. It's only like 6-7 minutes, something like that, and it outlines one of the more famous experiments that has been done in the field of like this organic chemistry, this biochemistry, and early life. And what it does is it basically, this experiment that they outline here puts a bunch of the stuff that we just talked about, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur, all of those different things found in different compounds. It puts like sulfuric acid in with pneumonia. I got COVID on the brain, with ammonia, CO2, carbon monoxide, all these different types of things that might have been seen in the early Earth, and they supplied some energy, and they wanted to see what would happen. And it turns out that under given conditions and the right conditions, certain precursors to macromolecules were formed. So things like amino acids, some very, very simple amino acids were formed. Precursors to nucleic acids were formed. And you put all of these things together in bigger molecules, you get the molecules of life. You get proteins and DNA and stuff like this. And so it's a really neat experiment that kind of looks to prove where the origin of life came from. It was oftentimes thought that early Earth, beginning Earth, it was nothing more than just nothing more than a stew of chemicals and all these different things that are in the atmosphere and in these like little primordial soup pools and stuff like this. And it's scientists' kind of great goal to figure out, all right, how did a giant mass of chemicals in the atmosphere turn into ultimately what we see as life today? And to do that, if you think things started out very simply as chemicals and molecules and compounds and atoms, you've got to find a way to put them together abiotically without life being there. And somehow these things have to be put together. And so that's what this video describes. It describes the elements that we just listed on the previous slide coming together through chemical reactions to create the molecules of life. Now, there are some inherent difficulties with this particular experiment. Maybe the mixtures weren't right. A lot of people have tried to poke holes in them or in this experiment, and it wasn't perfect. Like most experiments are not perfect, but the idea of it is quite elegant. And I do encourage you to watch it, invest the time to understand what was in that experiment. It's one of the more famous ones that you'll know, or that you hear about in biology, and it's also one of the ones that will be represented probably in some form or fashion on the AP tests. I know that in my tests, I've included questions with this experiment as their kind of focal point. Okay, so definitely look into it and see what this one's all about. All right, so since the carbon atom seems to be such an important part of life, what makes it so important? Well, it turns out that carbon is tetravalent, and a tetravalent atom means that it's got 4 unpaired valence electrons. And what we know about chemistry, and I'm not super well versed in chemistry anymore. I taught it once a while back, but one of the things I've always remembered is that the valence electrons are the ones in the outer shell, and it's those valence electrons that oftentimes are the ones that participate in bond formation. Whether those electrons that you see on the screen in front of you are lost if it's a given type of atom, or whether those electrons are shared with other atoms, depends obviously on the atom under study. But in this case with carbon, it has 4 different sites, if you will, 4 different areas where it will share electrons. And most oftentimes, carbon will make very complex, large molecules because it shares those outer electrons with other atoms, and it's basically got 4 spots, which is almost the maximum. There are some of those rare few exceptions, like I don't know, it doesn't like phosphorus bond to like 5 different things sometimes, and sulfur binds to a number of things that it shouldn't bind to. But carbon, for the most part, has this tetravalent structure which allows it to bond to 4 different things, and so this makes carbon an extremely versatile atom to make bigger things from, which we're going to ultimately get a little lesson on as we work our way through. Okay, so let's talk about very basic building on the carbon skeleton. A hydrocarbon molecule is a term that describes a long carbon and hydrogen chain. Okay, a long carbon and hydrogen chain. And what that means, I'm going to try to transition here back and forth between a document cam and the document cam and the PowerPoint. Okay, so a hydrocarbon basically means that there's C's connected to C's, and all these C's, if they're not connected to another C, they're connected to an H. Okay, this is the most basic understanding of organic chemistry. You put a bunch of C's together in a chain, and then you surround all the C's until they have bonded with H's. That's the most simple hydrocarbon chain that you can put together. Okay, so this is what we would call a very basic hydrocarbon. And one of the things that you'll notice here is if you take let's just take this number 1 carbon right here. We say, look at this number 1 carbon. It's connected to 1, 2, 3, 4 different things, right? Because it's tetravalent. It shares those 4 things, or shares those 4 valence electrons with other things. Okay, so it's able to make very large things. It can make very small things as well, but makes very large things when it wants to. Okay, so we'll bring that document camera back. I kind of like that little thing there. And that can create a basic hydrocarbon skeleton that is almost like a framework. And you'll notice that when we start to muck around with or change this carbon skeleton, that we can make all sorts of different types of things. Okay, so these bonds that we saw in that drawing previously, the carbon to hydrogen bonds and the carbon to carbon bonds, those are non-polar covalent bonds. And so when you have hydrocarbons, you have these big long chains of carbon hooked to carbon, or carbons hooked to hydrogens, or however you might describe it, those are considered really highly non-polar molecules. Okay, and that's going to have some implications when we start to talk about how these things might mix with water and how they might interact inside of a cell, which is highly water-based. Okay. Now, some examples of hydrocarbons that you might have heard of: fossil fuels. If you've ever heard of the term octane, okay, I don't know how many of you guys pump your own gas or have learned how to pump your own gas. There's some people you believe don't even know how to pump their own gas. But if you ever pump your own gas, you might have heard the term octane because you might have looked at something on the gas pump and realized to yourself, oh, that sounds like a weird word. And what octane tells you is the number of carbons. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The number of carbons that are actually in that chain. So in this case, when you have the molecule called octane, you have octo, meaning 8 carbons linked together, and each one of those is going to be surrounded with hydrogens. Okay. So fossil fuels are a good example of a long hydrocarbon. You also see these hydrocarbons as frameworks for large organic macromolecules of life. One of the ones that comes to mind right off the bat is a fat molecule. Fat molecules, let's see here, get my pointer, are these guys right here. We're going to talk more in depth about fat molecules in chapter 5, but this right here is a fatty acid. Okay, this is called a triglyceride. And each one of these long tails that you see at the bottom here is a hydrocarbon chain. Okay, all of these little black spheres are carbons surrounded by these gray spheres, which are hydrogens. Okay, and then these red ones up here are oxygens. They kind of produce like this little framework that holds these 3 tails in place. When you get a bunch of these fatty triglycerides together, you put them together in this tissue called adipose tissue, or fat. This is the stuff that, in liposuction, they suck it out of your body. Or this is the stuff you burn off when you're trying to lose weight. Okay, this is the stuff that's embedded under your skin as, a long-term energy storage plant. So an example of a long hydrocarbon molecule that we see in life is the one that you see in front of you. In addition, we're going to see many, many others. Okay, so do keep in mind that these are things that we will come back to and revisit. Now, carbon's compatibility is something I've kind of talked on already for a couple of minutes in some of the other slides, but carbon frequently combines with oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen in organic molecules. And so I want you to learn the valence number for these electrons, because oftentimes you'll see them connected to a certain number of other atoms, okay? So for instance, we look at hydrogen here. Hydrogen will want to connect with one other thing. It likes to share its valence electron with one other thing to complete its shell. If we look at, that thing doesn't work. If we look at oxygen, it's kind of covering one of the unpaired electrons down here. But oxygen has a valence number of 2, which tells us that it likes to make 2 bonds with other things. Okay? Nitrogen has 3 valence electrons, which means it wants to make 3 bonds or share those valence electrons with other things. And carbon, as we see, has 4. So I think it's in your interest to understand at least what you're looking at in some of the organic molecule diagrams that we're eventually going to come to when we get to chapter 5. You might see a picture of nitrogen, and you might see it connected to 3 other things. And the reason that it is connected to 3 other things is because at its core it has 3 valence electrons that it ultimately wants to share to make bonds with. Okay? And that's what makes carbon such a diverse molecule, or molecule atom, for creating these really, really diverse variations in the carbon skeletons, what we see in organic molecules. So there are different ways that we can vary or change the carbon skeletons, and depending on what we do to the carbon skeletons, it will affect not only obviously the structure but also the function. But the important part that I want you to understand is that when we change these skeletons, so I'm going to go through a series of different kind of examples of this. When we change these things on the carbon skeleton, what it actually does is it doesn't look like we do a whole lot, right? We might add a teeny tiny little element here or do a double bond there. But what it's doing is actually changing it subtly. It's changing not only the structure but the function as well. Okay, so let's talk about how we can change carbon skeletons to make them different. Okay, to make different things from a very, very simple kind of framework. All right, number one thing we could do, we could change the length of the carbon skeleton. Okay, we could change the length of a carbon skeleton. So let me, I'm going to back out of this real quick. Back here. And I'm going to, see, this is always fun. I like to gauge your understanding of organic chemistry by asking you guys questions here. So, at home, while you guys are watching this, if I ask a question, see if you can't pause the video and answer it real quick, okay? And then we'll go from there. So, one of the things I'm going to start with here is this molecule. Tell me, or tell yourself, if you know what the name of this organic molecule is. Okay, the name of this organic molecule is ethane. Ethane. Okay? And so what we're doing, we are changing, let me go back here, we are changing the length of the carbon skeleton. All right, so I'm going to take that ethane molecule that I've just created, and all I'm going to do is change the length of the carbon skeleton. And for time's sake, I'm not going to draw all the hydrogens in anymore. Okay, you should know that if we're just talking about basic hydrocarbon skeletons, that each one of those C's will be surrounded by H's. Okay, what's the name of this one? Okay, and the name of this one is propane. Okay, let's do it again. Change the length of the carbon skeleton. Now we've got 4 carbons. 4 carbons. Any guess what that one's called? You've seen it before. You've probably played with it a little bit. This one's called butane. Butane. Okay? And so based on what we see in front of us, all we've done is add a carbon. Okay, so we've got C2H count that, 6, right? C3H8, C4H, yeah, that's 10, right? H10. C4H10. It doesn't seem like we've done a lot here, but we really have. We've taken ethane and we've made it into propane. We've taken propane, and when we add a carbon and a couple hydrogens, we get a butane. Okay? Now, they all might be similar. I don't know a whole lot about ethane. I know a little bit about protein and butane. Propane is something we put in tanks and we cook on the grill with it, right? So we know it's flammable. Butane is also found in something that you use to light on fire. This is found in lighters, okay? So we see propane and butane kind of do similar things. We use them to light on fire. We use them as a fuel, okay? But just the fact that we've added a carbon plus 2 extra hydrogens when we make butane has drastically changed its overall properties. Yes, it's subtly changed the structure, but it's drastically changed the properties, okay? Maybe butane has a flash point that is lower than propane. I don't know. I haven't studied either one of these. You could probably look them up, right? I know that they smell subtly different. Okay, you could probably tell the difference between propane and butane, but they are similar. They probably have the similar kind of gas smell, but there's probably some distinct differences in both of them. Okay, maybe they burn at different temperatures as well. So those are examples of what we do to the molecule when we alter the carbon chain. Okay, when we alter the length of the carbon chain. All right, I'm not going to get back into the presentation for this one. I'm just going to read it off the slide and then buzz right back into the document camera. But we can take these carbon skeletons and we can alter the number and the location of double bonds. Okay, so let's play around with double bonds. Just like a lot of the other molecules that you might have studied at some point, you can make double bonds between carbons. You can't make double bonds between carbons and hydrogens. That's not possible. At least I don't know of any situations where it's possible. So let's take this one up here. Okay, you guys should remember what that is. Okay, take a guess. I'm going to write it down. It is ethane. All right. Now let's say I keep the number of carbons. Okay, so I keep the number of carbons the same. I'm not adding any carbons. I'm not altering the length of the carbon chain. But instead of one bond between the carbons, now I'm going to put 2. So there's a double bond here between the carbons. Okay, so if we look at this carbon has attachments to 1, 2, 3, 4 things. Okay, which is what we would normally think. This carbon has attachments to 1, 2, 3, 4 things, so it's good to go. Any guesses as to what we call this? Okay, it is ethene. Ethene. Now, one of the things that's a naming convention that makes it easier to decipher what these organic molecules do is that whenever you see this ANE, it means that it's all single bonds. Okay, it's all single bonds. Anytime you see this this suffix ENE, it means there's a double bond located somewhere in there. Okay, let's do this. I think this is actually a thing. Any guesses as to what this one's called? Okay, it still has the prefix eth, but in this case, YNE is going to be added. This one's called ethyne. What do you think ethyne indicates about that particular molecule? Yep, the fact that it's got 3 bonds in the middle. This got a triple bond somewhere. Okay? Now, I don't know a whole lot about ethane versus ethene versus ethyne, but I could bet that you get a nice big chemistry book that tells you all about the physical properties of these things, that they're going to have different flash points, that they're going to have different maybe melting points and freezing points and things of that nature. They're going to have different properties. Okay? And all we've done here is we've added bonds in between the carbons and taken away a couple of hydrogens. It doesn't seem like much to us, right? It doesn't seem like, oh, that's easy, right? But that's actually probably a pretty hard thing to do. And when we do things like that, it actually changes the properties. Okay? It produces this variation. We've got variation in the carbon skeleton, and we've got variation in the properties of the organic molecule as a result. Okay. I'm not done. Why'd I do that? Another thing I want to go through here Let's do this molecule. This is always a fun one. I'm just going to do a little quizzing for you guys here. That molecule is called what? All single bonds. Okay, you should remember that is butane. Crash course, organic chemistry, good. All right, let's, I'm going to leave off all of these things as well because that's getting tedious as well. Let's go ahead and do this. Any guesses as to what that one is called? Okay. This one is called 1-butene. I bet you could have guessed that we have put the ene suffix on the end because there is a double bond in the original butane molecule, right? And this little 1 that we put right here indicates which carbon it comes off of first. So in this case, this is the number 1 carbon. This is the number 2, 3, and 4 carbon. Okay? All right, I'm going to draw this one for you. Next up. What's this one called? If you fell for the trick, I hope you did. This one is actually also called 1-butene. You ask yourself, well, Sutherland, you said this one was called 1-butene because it comes off this number 1 carbon. Well, in organic chemistry, the one thing that you have to think about is you have to think about 3 dimensions, because I can just take this molecule, take it off the page and flip it in space, and put it back down on the page, and I got this thing here. It's called 1-butene. I know, stupid, right? But they're going to hammer you with that in college, and you're going to hate it, and then you're going to say, well, you should have told me better, Sutherland. I did. It's right there. Okay, so anyway, I just like to play that little game, see if you guys can figure out what some of these things are called. But anyway, that shows you how altering the location of the double bonds might change. In this case, these are the same thing. Let's add one more. Forgot this one more. All right, let's see what you can figure out. What's that one called? That one is called 2-butene. 2-butene, okay, because that double bond is located between the 2 and 3 carbons, the numbers 2 and 3 carbons. So I can guarantee you, I don't know much about 1-butene versus 2-butene, but I can guarantee you that their physical properties are going to be different. Yes, the fact that we added some double bonds to ethane, okay, between the 2 carbons, changed its properties. That's a big thing, right? But even in something like this, when we alter the location of the double bond, yeah, we altered the location here, but all we did was flip it in 3-dimensional space. Here we took and put the double bond right smack dab in the middle. You think to yourself, okay, it's got the exact same, formula. It's C4H8 or something like that, C4H6 or something. I'm not going to go through and do the math right now. Yes, C4H8. But in this case, the double bond is right here, and in this case, the double bond is right here. That small, subtle difference is going to change the physical properties of 2-butene as compared to 1-butene. All right. Let's look at the last thing that happens here. The other way that we can get some variation in the carbon skeleton that will affect not only the structure but the function of these organic molecules. Okay? Let's look at changing the elements with which carbon bonds. All right, this one's always fun for me. I like doing this one quite a bit here. All right, let's maximize that guy there. All right, let's start off with this. I'm going to do this guy right here. I'm going to draw the H's in this case because I think at some point it's going to be important that you see those. Anybody know what that one's called? That's called methane. That's in farts. Methane's in farts. Okay, it's in cow farts and your farts and everybody's farts. Everybody farts. All right, so that's methane. This one we established earlier is, yep, you should be able to get this before I'm even done writing all the H's. We've established this one as ethane. Okay, good, yes? All right, let me overlay this. All right, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to change an element that each of these is attached to. Okay, so I'm going to add all H's here. And for this one, I'm going to put OH. That's a functional group. Okay, we'll talk about what that functional group is in a minute. Does anybody know what we call this now that we've changed this hydrogen that was there? Okay, we did have this, and now we've got this. So we changed this to this. Anybody know what they call this molecule? What happens to the suffix of -ane when you put this OH group? This OH group is called an alcohol group, if that helps you out. This new molecule is called not methamphetamines, not meth, crystal meth, but methanol. Methanol. Okay, it takes that kind of alcohol term and puts it in there. All right, let's go down to this one. And we're going to put the OH here. Okay, knowing what the previous one was called, we called this other one ethane, right? I bet you can figure out what this one's called. Okay, that is called ethanol. Ethanol. Okay, so what we've done here, as the previous slide said, is we've changed the molecule that is attached to one of the carbons. Instead of having an H like we had done in the previous ones, we attached this functional group called the alcohol group. Okay? And so what that's going to do is going to change the properties. And it's going to change them even compared to what methanol is versus ethanol. Okay? Now, anybody know where you find ethanol? Okay? Ethanol is found in fuel. Okay? Nowadays, it had not been until, within the past 30, 40, 50 years or whatever. Okay? We also find it in booze. Okay? You find it in beer and vodka and wine. It's in everything that you would consider booze. Okay? Anybody know where you find methanol or what methanol? So this one here, ethanol, is something people drink to have a good time. Anybody know what happens when you drink methanol? You drink methanol, you go blind. Okay? You drink methanol, you go blind. If you drink enough of it, you die. Okay? Now, there's something interesting that happens when you make certain types of alcohol, certain types of booze. If anybody has ever watched the show Moonshiners, it's on Discovery Channel. You guys, I don't know, unless it's on Netflix, you probably have never seen it. So if you ever get to Discovery Channel on actual cable, go watch Moonshiners every now and then. Because what you find out in Moonshiners is that when, through the distillation process, basically it's making corn liquor, okay, corn whiskey. Through that distillation process, one of the first things that distills or comes out of the still as a product is methanol, okay? And good moonshiners, if you want to call them that, experts, people who have been doing it in their family for years, know this because they've had people probably in their families at one point go blind from it. But they know that the methanol comes out first, so they wait for it, they grab the methanol, and they throw it out, right? People who suck at moonshining, who just do it in their basement because they saw this show and thought it was cool, might not know that. Maybe they were doing something they shouldn't have and skipped that portion of the TV program. And what they do is they actually will forget to throw out the methanol part of the moonshine, and they will have it continuously mixed in with the ethanol, okay? And so what that does, if you are buying bootleg moonshine out of the back of somebody's trunk or out of some shady alley or something like that, I don't recommend that, so don't do that. You get this weird concoction mixture of some methanol and some ethanol, and you don't know the methanol is in there, and you drink it and you go blind, and if you drink enough of it, you die, okay? Which is one of the reasons why the federal government is always after these moonshiners, because if you make moonshine incorrectly And without regulation, there's that risk that you're going to buy a gallon of moonshine from the back of somebody's truck and it'll kill you. Okay, so do keep that in mind. What we see here, just even the difference in one carbon group here from methanol to ethanol is enough to change that. One, you know, obviously if you drink enough ethanol, you'll die. But just the drastic difference between drinking a little bit of methanol and a little bit of ethanol, one could kill you or make you blind. The other one, you drink the same amount, you're going to have a good time. Okay, but not until you're 21. That is not me advocating for you going out and doing something stupid. I'm just telling you the chemistry and the organic chemistry behind it, because it's actually pretty neat. Okay, so let's get back into this. Oh, that's not going to do it. And I think that's where I intended to get with this first lecture. I intended to get this far and go through those diagrams. So I'm going to pause it here. I'm going to stop it here, and I'm going to pick up in another video that's a little bit that's about the same length as this one, and we're going to start to discuss isomers. I thought this was a really good transition point because we're starting to talk about how subtle differences in changing the carbon skeleton can change the can actually change the properties of it. Now we're going to talk about how even more subtle differences in the structure to the point where you have the exact same chemical formula, but you're just putting it together differently, is going to change some of the properties as well in a very drastic way, I might add. So I will see you in the next video.